Hi, I'm Chad. Welcome back to the channel. Today I have a real treat for you. Last year, if you saw this on the main K4 channel, I had an opportunity to interview an author of one of my favorite books about financial planning, Mr. Frederick Vettese. And today I had an opportunity to interview him again. If you don't know who he is, he's written a myriad of different books. He's also responsible for something called Perk Online, PERC, which there'll be a link in the description below. It's a great place to go and get yourself started on some of your financial planning practices and keep yourself up to date. In particular, the book that I gravitate towards so much is called Retirement Income for Life. And as of January 2024, there's a third copy that just came out. So there's three copies of this book. First one was written in 2018. The second one was written in 2020, right in the heart of COVID, when things were as volatile as possible. And this newest one, like I said, is coming out January of 2024. So it's just on shelves now. I've already gone through it. It's a great book. There's lots of new additions to it. And that is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. So let's get into it. All right, Mr. Vettese, thank you so much for being here again. Welcome here. How have you been over the last year or so?
I've been great. Life is good.
That's fantastic to hear. Cool. I know you're a busy guy. You have exciting things planned even today, you were just mentioning. So I won't take up much of your time. We'll jump into it. For you watching, I hope you've had an opportunity to either buy or read a copy of Retirement Income for Life by Mr. Vettese here. His latest version just came out January of 2024. I just got my copy and read it on a vacation with my family. It was a good read. Probably a little less exciting than some of the reads that my nephews and nieces were reading, but it was still a good read to me nonetheless. Today's interview is really about the additions to the book on this third copy. So what I'll do here is I'll just lay out some of the evolution of the book, and then we'll jump into the questions. So Mr. Vettese highlights different enhancements for your retirement plan and maximizing the money that you have. And he does this, and it's evolved over the three different books. And in this one, it's reduce fees, which that one's been static since the very beginning. Transfer risk to the government by delaying CPP. That one's also been static. Transfer even more risk by exploring annuities. Number 4 is using Perk, which is an online retirement planning software that Mr. Vettese has taken over, and it's been evolving considerably, especially over the last couple of years, to make sure that you're having regular updates to your financial plan. And last is just to have a backstop, whether that be through a reverse mortgage or a HELOC. And those are really, the advantages of those are really dependent on your situation. But those are the 5 that are in the book, and please go and read it if you want to explore those more. But again, this interview will be more about the new additions here. So the first chapter that I really spent the majority of my time in that was brand new was just a really deep dive into CPP and OAS. And with CPP being such an important part of most people's financial plans, most of the viewers here have heard me talk ad nauseum about CPP timing. Would you mind just sharing some of your thoughts about CPP in general, CPP timing? How should people be looking at CPP?
Well, first thing I would say is that it was an oversight that I hadn't had a chapter about CPP and OAS in the previous editions. I mean, it's such an important part of most people's retirement. So that's why I added it. I also put into that chapter some aspects that wouldn't be in the usual summary. Things like, what happens if you delay CPP until age 70 and OAS until 70. A few other quirks that people don't usually talk about when it comes to both of them. So I covered that in the chapter. And the big thing is, it usually makes sense to be deferring the Canada Pension Plan pension until, I say age 70, but close to age 70. So that is enhancement number 2. And I've shown in my example that's in the book of a couple who retire that they end up being able to extend their income right to the end of their lives, as long as they defer CPP and OAS until age 70, something they couldn't do if they took it at 65. Now, I say 70, but another quirk or something else that I've introduced in the third edition is that you may not always want to wait until age 70 per se. The last couple of years have been interesting. Wage inflation has not kept up with price inflation. Usually, wage inflation outstrips price inflation. It hasn't for the last 2 years. And what it's meant is that for anybody who was going to be getting their CPP in the following year, let's say people in 2023 who were going to start in 2024 regardless, they actually would be better off starting it in December 2023. That same thing was true in December 2022 versus 23. So that's 2 years in a row that that's been the case, and that's been because price inflation, which is CPI based, has been outstripping wage inflation. So I don't know if it's going to happen again in the future. It doesn't usually, and you'd figure that if we're going to have worker shortages at some point, that you'd see wage increases going up even faster than they have historically. Hasn't happened yet though. So that's one thing I stressed in the book, that maybe you want to start it at 69 as opposed to 70. The other thing I've stressed in the book, which I did in the previous editions, is that old age security, you should really think about deferring that until 70 as well. Why didn't I do that before? There were two reasons. One is it's such a tough sell to get people to defer CPP until 70 that there was just no point in mentioning deferring OAS as well, because they just won't do it. But it does make sense. And the second reason why it makes so much sense is because of inflation. And that really is one of the big themes in the new edition of the book.
Yeah.
Frankly, I thought inflation was pretty much dead. It had been, I guess, hovering around 2% ever since the early 1990s. And all of a sudden, of course, in the last couple of years, because of the pandemic, we saw inflation spike up above 8%. And even now, we're still fighting the inflation battle. And, even though COVID will go away, we'll forget about it one of these days, you just never know what is going to be spiking inflation again in the future. So it isn't dead, and we just don't know when it's going to be rearing its ugly head again. So what I've learned is that we need to have protection against inflation, and by deferring OAS until 70, you're increasing that protection against inflation because you have a bigger pension that's inflation protected for the rest of your life.
Right. And that kind of like that goes back to some of my analogies on the channel. I talk about foundational income, structural income, and finishing income. Foundational is the stuff that you can rely on. It's boring. It's not linked to a market. CPP, OAS, defined benefit pensions if you happen to have them, GIS if you happen to qualify for that. And I'm a big fan of maximizing that. So I really like that you talked about delaying OAS in there. I've joked with lots of clients though that like less than 1% of Canadians take CPP at 70. So I know you're already have your friends think you're nuts. And if you're delaying both CPP and OAS, you'll never be invited back. And it is definitely a tough sell, but the math can speak to it a lot. You've covered off like 8 or 9 of my questions here, so I'll try to jump back here. Back to the CPP question. It's 2024. We're having new CPP changes this year. We're having the YAMPE, the yearly additional maximum pensionable earnings. That one's not locked into my muscle memory quite yet. Why is that being added, and is it doing the job it's intended to?
It's being added for all the wrong reasons. It's actually one of the most cynical things that's happened, and nobody seems to realize it. It hasn't been covered by any newspaper article. First of all, I'm going to give you the basic reason as to why it's been added, and there is one good reason and one cynical. The good reason is that CPP is being expanded. Up until now, the idea of CPP was to give you 25% of your income up to about the average national wage. That's always been the idea behind CPP ever since 1966. And what the government did back in 2016, I believe, is the finance ministers got together and decided that it had to be expanded. And so the idea is that ultimately they're going to be phasing in a CPP that instead of being 25%, will be 33%. And instead of being up to the average national wage, it'll be up to 14% above the average national wage. Why 14? I don't know, but 14% above that. And so that's the reason for the additional, the YAMPE, as you call it. It takes the earnings ceiling for CPP up another 14%. It's happening in two tranches. This year it's rising by 7%. Next year it'll be another 7%, and then it'll be fully phased in. That part will be phased in. The actual benefit, it's going to take 40 years before you get the full additional amount, so you can actually get 33% of that higher earnings ceiling. So that's the reason why they're doing it. So the cynical thing about this is, and I've asked the question, why, of the government, why did they simply not change the YMPE so that it became 14% more? Because they still have a YMPE as
Yeah.
well as Y. And I don't want to get too technical here, but they have two things, a YMPE and a YAMPE. And here's the cynical reason as to why they did this. The civil service workers, so this would be the public sector, certainly the federal workers, and virtually the public sector in every province as well, already have the richest pension in Canada. Federal is actually a bit richer than the other plans, but they're all very rich. And they provided not only 70% for people who have a full career with them, provided more like 78% because of old age security pension, which they don't include for some reason. So they were already getting, and that 78%, you might say, well, that's less than 100. But if you look on a net basis, after tax and after expenses and after mortgage payments and everything else, and after retirement saving, they end up having much more than 100% of their disposable income payable to them after retirement versus before retirement. So they already had that. So by having the YAMPE, it enabled them to actually increase their pension even further. And rather than try to explain it, just you can accept it on faith that if they had just simply expanded the YMPE, that wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have had that expansion of their pension, but they do have that, and their pension ends up being about 10% more than it would have been otherwise.
Interesting.
And
Interesting. Yeah,
this
no,
is
it's
what the government
been,
felt they had to do in order to sell it to the provinces and to the public sector.
yeah, I mean, it's a question I'm getting a lot these days about why is this going up now? And yeah, no, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. But you're saying the benefits of it, so on the positive side of things, you're saying the benefits of it won't really be seen for 30 to 40 years. So really it's for like the Gen Z.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're seeing a little bit of it already, but only a tiny fraction. For example, right now, the percentage we're getting of CPP for people who are retiring now is about 26% and change versus the 25. So it'll take quite a while to get up to 33.33%, which is going to be the maximum. As I say, it'll take about 40 years, but people will be getting an increasing
Yeah,
amount of that pension over the next 40 years.
interesting. Okay. In one of your other new chapters titled "Can We Do Better?" you take the enhancements a little bit further. This is really where you explore the math of delaying OAS, which we've already talked about. And you revisited the idea of annuities here. And when we spoke a year ago, pretty much exactly a year ago, annuities were only okay. And they weren't as strong of a recommendation then as they were when you wrote your first version in 2018. Now the environment has changed again. What are your thoughts on annuities today in 2024?
My thoughts are complicated. The bottom line would be, and I should say the short answer would be, I'm not as keen on annuities as I was 5 years ago. And that's kind of ironic because interest rates are up, which means the cost of buying an annuity is down. So this would, in terms of interest rates, this would be the best time to buy one for over the past 15, 20 years. So why am I not as keen on them as I used to be? And that's once again because of inflation. Annuities are not inflation protected. At least your basic life annuity is not inflation protected. So you're not getting that inflation protection. That's why I don't usually recommend that people devote more than 20 or 25% of their savings toward buying an annuity. But does it still make sense? I did the analysis in the book and I said, yeah, it still makes sense, especially if you're afraid that there's going to be a bad spell coming up, like a real correction in the stock markets. And you want to have that protection in your retirement. I mean, we're not going to live forever. We can't necessarily wait 20 years for the markets to to right themselves. So
Right.
yeah, it still makes some sense, but and so I'm not saying that you shouldn't be buying one. I'm just not that super keen about them,
Right.
just because of inflation. But there are other things out there.
Yeah, and it's so like situational as well, right? There's lots of people who it does make sense for, and those that it doesn't, for sure. One of the last new chapters that I'll bring up, and there's probably a few more that I missed, is just what if inflation stays high? And we've talked about inflation quite a bit already, but in your mind, do you see like where do you see inflation for the next little while? Like you said, it's been 2% for such a long time. That's what the government will be really aiming at. Do you think we're going to enter into an environment like the 70s where it was like back and forth, up and down, probably averaging around 8% for an extended period? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't really think so. I've always thought inflation was going to be staying low just because of demographics. We don't have the same demographics we had in the 1970s. At that point, we had a young, dynamic population. A young population, they tend to be borrowers. They're buying their first house or they're leasing a car. They're so they have to borrow money, and so supply and demand means that interest rates have to be higher because they need money. And we should be more like a nation of savers because a lot more of us are now retired. We have our assets, and what we're trying to do is get the best return on those assets. So,
Mhm.
so the supply demand balance has changed. For that reason, this is very different from the 1970s.
Yeah.
And having said that, I mean, we now know that inflation can go up. What can change that supply demand balance would be some kind of a black swan event like the pandemic, where all of a sudden the government just printed a lot more money and flooded the economy with money. And this is in Europe and U.S. and certainly in Canada. And we're still not quite over that binge of spending. So my best guess would be inflation is going to go back down to around the 2% level. That's probably going to happen in the next 12 months, assuming that, especially if the Bank of Canada maintains its resolve. And once it does that, it'll probably stay around that level, the 2%, for the foreseeable future until something else happens, and there might be another black swan event. Something may happen. Who knows? That'll be tipping that apple cart, and it may be and happen in 5 years, may happen in 15 years, or may not happen at all in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that you're right in that regard, and I believe as well that we're going to be returning into that range. I'm not sure again how soon, just like you were saying, who knows how soon we'll get back to the 2%. But man, oh man, have we ever seen crazy increases over the last couple of years.
Right.
On the topic of that printing of money, and this is a curveball question that I'm just thinking of here. So the government printed money, like you said, for a lot of people in and during COVID. And say what you will about politicians, we won't go that direction. But it did really help rescue a lot of people. Of course, there was always people taking advantage of it. Do you think, and do you want to weigh in on, do you think there would be some sort of change to our taxation system in the next couple of years or maybe 10, 15 years?
Change to the taxation system that'll hurt retirees, you mean?
Uh, I don't necessarily mean retirees, although they would certainly be impacted. I just mean do you see something changing to help compensate for that money that was printed so much in 2020?
Biggest likely change that people were expecting and hasn't happened yet would be that the capital gains inclusion rate would change. So instead of 50% of capital gains being taxed, that it would be a higher percentage, like 75%. That still is possible if the government wants to do something like that. Certainly, Trudeau government doesn't seem to be interested at all in cutting spending in order to avoid something like that. So
Right.
I'd say that something like that would still be possible. That would be like the most obvious change I see. Raising tax rates even higher than they are already, that would be hard to do, but it's possible. I mean, usually the you get into the red zone after 50%, but we're already at around 54%. So
Yeah.
I guess 57 wouldn't be crazy, or wouldn't be, well, it would be crazy, but it wouldn't be impossible.
Cool. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the channel. It's been an honor again talking with you. If you haven't yet, if you're watching still, if you haven't gone out and bought this book yet, I really do recommend it. It is specifically for your de-accumulation stage. So if you are 5, 10 years from retirement or just entering into retirement, this book is very specifically written for you. I can't believe the glare there. I'll do a better job in editing, putting that in there. But go recommend this book. I can't recommend it enough. Mr. Vettese, thank you again so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Chad.